September 1941. The horizon burns. German panzers grind across the earth, their engines a constant, low-frequency vibration that rattles the windows of every home in Leningrad. General von Lieb has issued the order. No surrender, no mercy, only erasure. Inside the perimeter, the rhythm of the city changes instantly. Millions of citizens drop their tools and pick up shovels. They dig miles of anti-tank ditches into the soft, yielding soil, their hands raw and blistered. They work in silence, watching the dust clouds rise in the distance where the enemy lines tighten. Then, the final connection snaps. On September 8th, the last rail link to the mainland is severed. The iron ring closes. There is no way out. The city is now an island in a sea of steel, surrounded by a force that intends to starve it into oblivion. The sky turns gray, the wind picks up, and the residents look toward the horizon. The panzers are closer now. The siege has begun. October arrived, not with a whisper, but with a roar. The sky over Leningrad filled with the high-pitched whine of Luftwaffe engines, a sound that sent thousands scrambling for cover. The target was clear, the Badayev warehouses. These structures held the city's lifeblood, thousands of tons of sugar and flour. The first wave of bombs struck with surgical precision. The earth shook as the buildings disintegrated, sending plumes of black smoke spiraling into the clouds. Inside the warehouses, the heat became an inferno. Sugar melted into a sticky, bubbling sludge, while flour turned into a fine, choking dust. The air grew heavy, thick with the acrid, unmistakable smell of charred grain and ruin. Citizens emerged from their shelters to see the horizon glowing. They stood in the streets, watching their survival burn. The fire consumed the reserves that were meant to last through the winter. As the flames licked the night sky, the reality of the situation took hold. The city was no longer just under siege. It was being erased. The warehouses were now nothing more than smoldering piles of debris, and the smell of burnt food lingered in the air for days. The city watched the smoke rise, knowing the hunger would follow. November arrived with a lethal, biting frost that turned the city into a tomb of ice. The temperature plummeted to -30 degrees, a cold so deep it seemed to solidify the very air. In the central districts, the heating system failed. Pipes groaned under the pressure of expanding ice before they burst, sending torrents of water into stairwells and hallways. Within hours, the water froze into jagged, translucent sculptures. The apartments became uninhabitable. Residents retreated into single rooms, sealing windows with rags and paper. But the frost seeped through the walls. To keep the cold from their lungs, the people began a grim, systematic dismantling of their lives. They took axes to their wooden furniture. They tore shelves from the walls and fed their books into small, makeshift stoves. The walls grew white with rime, and the breath of the inhabitants hung in the air like thick, frozen mist. December brought the hunger, a hollow ache that gnawed at the city's remaining strength. The daily bread ration was slashed to a mere 125 grams. This was no longer bread in any traditional sense. It was a dark, heavy mixture of flour, sawdust, and cellulose. People stood in queues that snaked for blocks, their feet numb, their bodies swaying in the biting wind. Their breath turned into tiny, suspended ice crystals. Hours passed in a silence, broken only by the rhythmic, distant thud of artillery. No one spoke. To speak was to waste precious energy. The line moved forward by inches, a slow, shuffling procession of ghosts. Then, the inevitable happened. A man near the front slumped forward. He did not rise. No one reached out to help him, for the strength to lift another was a luxury no one possessed. His body remained where it fell. Further down the line, a woman leaned against a brick wall, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her breathing shallow and ragged until it stopped entirely. The queue simply shifted around these fallen figures, a grim, mechanical movement that ignored the dead. The city was starving. Beyond the starving streets, a thin, fragile thread connected the city to the world. On the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, The darkness was absolute, broken only by the dim, flickering headlights of a line of trucks. They moved in a slow, rhythmic crawl across the ice. Beneath the tires, the lake groaned a deep, resonant sound of shifting plates. The ice was never solid. It was a treacherous, shifting skin that threatened to give way at any moment. Every driver kept their door unlatched and pushed open, a desperate, calculated gamble against the freezing water below. If the surface shattered, they would have seconds to leap clear before the vehicle dragged them into the depths. They hauled heavy sacks of flour, the cargo of survival, while the return trips carried the sick and the elderly. It was a race against the elements, a constant, high-stakes gamble where the only prize was another day of life. Inside the Philharmonic Hall, the air was a solid, freezing weight. The musicians gathered on the stage, their breath blooming in thick clouds that hung in the stagnant air. They sat motionless, their bodies trembling from the relentless cold. To play, they had to wrap their fingers in strips of rags, a desperate measure to keep skin from tearing away against the frozen metal. The silence in the hall was heavy, broken only by the sharp, metallic click of keys and the tightening of strings. Then, the first notes rose. The music did not merely fill the hall. It surged outward, amplified by loudspeakers mounted high above the streets. The sound traveled across the rubble-strewn blocks, reaching the edges of the German lines. Outside, the thunderous roar of artillery fire continued, but the symphony pushed against it, a defiant, soaring melody. The musicians played with a frantic, bone-deep intensity, their gaunt faces set. For 1 hour, the city did not sound like a graveyard. It sounded like a challenge. The guns continued, but they were not the only voice. By 1943, the Iron Ring began to show signs of metal fatigue. Soviet soldiers waited for the signal, huddled in trenches carved into the frozen mud. When the order came, they surged forward, not in a wave, but in a desperate, grinding push. The German lines erupted in machine gun fire, pinning the first battalions to the earth. The air filled with the sharp, biting scent of cordite and the spray of pulverized snow. A micro-turn occurred when the momentum stalled. The ground became a churned mess of ice and debris. Officers signaled for a secondary push, and the infantry rose again, ignoring the lethal crossfire to close the distance. They fought for every meter, using grenades to clear bunkers and bayonets to hold the ground they gained. The assault was brutal and costly, but the pressure proved relentless. By nightfall, the impossible happened. The line buckled. A narrow, jagged corridor was carved through the blockade, a thin artery of hope in a sea of steel. Supplies began to trickle in, carried by hand through the mud and the ruins. It was not a total victory, but the blockade was no longer absolute. January 1944 arrived, with a sky the color of iron. The front lines held a tense, vibrating silence until the first shell struck. Then, the earth itself seemed to tear open. Soviet artillery opened fire in a synchronized thunder that turned the horizon into a continuous wall of flame. The ground buckled under the weight of thousands of tons of steel. For miles, the landscape vanished behind a curtain of smoke and flying debris. Infantry surged forward the moment the barrage shifted, moving through the craters and the shattered remnants of the German defensive perimeter. The soldiers pushed with a singular, relentless momentum, ignoring the return fire that clawed at their flanks. They moved in tight, disciplined waves, bayonets fixed, closing the distance to the enemy bunkers. A micro-turn occurred when the lead units hit a fortified trench line, but they utilized the cratered earth for cover, flanking the position and silencing the guns within seconds. The German lines collapsed, kilometer by kilometer. The blockade was dismantled. The Iron Ring that had strangled the city for 872 days finally shattered. The city stood free. The roar of the guns finally died away, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Slowly, the cellar doors creaked open. Survivors emerged into the pale, thin light of the winter sun, blinking as their eyes adjusted to the brightness. They stood amidst the skeletal remains of their homes, surrounded by mountains of brick and twisted metal. The scale of the cost was absolute. Over 1 million people had perished in the dark, their lives extinguished by hunger and frost. Yet, the city remained. It was a landscape of ruins, but it was no longer a tomb. People began to move through the debris, their hands raw and trembling, clearing paths through the wreckage. They swept the glass from the streets and hauled away the stone, one piece at a time. The air, once thick with the smell of smoke and decay, began to shift. It was a slow, agonizing process, but the city started to breathe again. Every cleared street and every reopened door was a rejection of the silence the blockade had tried to impose. Leningrad did not fall. It endured. It stood as a haunting, jagged testament to human will, carving its name into the bedrock of history. The siege was over.